Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Not Too Comic Book. This being a show where I talk about TV shows that are adaptations of comic books. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the latest episode of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. A lot of really interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. This ended up not being the episode I thought it was, because I thought, like, oh man, the misadventures of the other team while, Mac and, Deke were stuck in the 80s, and it's like, no, like, basically for them it had only been like a few minutes because the time drive is so messed up that they jump like they say like 481 days at first, but then they jumped even more time, but it was like the time frame in between the jumps was getting shorter and shorter. So obviously that's why the whole 27-day thing, I was like, how do you mark it down like that? Because is there usually, and it's like, that's why, because it's like, we're going to end up jumping while you're gone, but we're going to be in this exact same position, because basically when the longitude and latitude haven't changed, because usually when Fitz does this, they end up in a different position entirely, not just in a different time. They're literally in a different time, but the exact same position. So using the same coordinates and stuff like that, it gives them a rough estimate. Like, all right, we'll be back here in a month's time. It'll be a month for you, but it'll be like 27 days for you, but it's going to be like a few minutes for us, so that's the craziness of this whole situation. So Matt, Deke, are back on board, which makes me wonder, what about the rest of the agents? I gotta know what their future is. Like, everyone back at the lighthouse, like, what's up with that? Where's that gonna be? So now it's a situation of like, all right, like the time drive, like basically what's happening is making it so like there's pulses moving so fast that no one can touch it, because anything that touches it gets disintegrated. So it's like, all right, well, we need our superstar to do this, but Yo-Yo's powers are still on the fritz. But then Daisy's like, well, my mom is here. She could, afterlife is a place we could go, but it's like, all right, so they have to be in this very delicate position, because it's like, well, they can't screw with anything, because if they're not careful, this will erase Daisy. Once again, this depends on how the time travel rules work, because the fact of the matter is they're already on a completely different timeline. So it's like, does their time exist anymore? Probably not. It's been rewritten to the point. I mean, it could still be rewritten, because like obviously that future is not 100% set in stone. I'm sure things have changed because Nathaniel's a part of everything now too, but it's like, once again, it's not like an end game situation where like your time stays the same and it splinters off into an alternate timeline, whatever changes you make. It's not like that. I think this goes to the more traditional thing of like, things are changing. So, Mac and his brother were fortunate enough position where by the time that happened by the time their parents were replaced, they were already born. Daisy hasn't been born yet, so it's that complicated thing of like, we need to be careful or we're gonna screw things up, on that end. So when it's all said and done, though, then there's, it has to be, May and Elena that, Yo-Yo that end up going. Because I think it would have been interesting if Yo-Yo went, but at the same time, it's like, well, that, she might screw up her own timeline and stuff like that. Might, Marty McFly herself out of existence. But it's also the thing of like, well, her and Jiaying, the last time they literally met was when her dad killed her mom, in front of, so there's that complicated thing of like, that'd probably be something in the back of your mind. I'm like, oh yeah, the last time we were literally face to face, I was in a position where I had to kill you, and I was about to, but my dad, to stop me from having to cross that line and live with that, he did it himself. So that's a whole thing within itself. So, but I also love like that little conversation between Elena and May, because May's like, yeah, like she's been feeling more and more, especially since the lighthouse, because she felt like Mac and Yo-Yo's reunion, she's like, oh, that's so embarrassing and like invasive, and it's just like they're kind of having a laugh about it. She's like, yeah. So they show up afterlife. There's a whole thing with Cora, like it's like, okay, what's her whole deal? She's trying to run away. Then they meet with Jiaying, and then like obviously the whole thing is like, at first, because they're trying to figure out, like, obviously you can't let too much be known about their situation, because it's like, all right, we need to come up with a cover story about, like, what happened to you. You mean, like, the whole alien bat flying into me, now I can't use my powers? It's like, yeah, tell the truth, but not all of that. So, and I love the whole thing of, like, you have to prove that you're an inhuman, and she grabs the stone, because Lee's like, oh, yeah, because if human touches it, they die, but if a human, Yo-Yo grabs it, and just kind of nothing happens, and then May's like, she's like, oh, right. Elena's like, prosthetic, and then touches her face, and it's like, yeah, inhuman, of course, because she had nothing to worry about. So I thought that was interesting, and obviously they're running all these tests and stuff like that. But obviously it's like, acupuncture she's kind of going through, and obviously she's kind of like a little antsy, and I love that May's just kind of like feeling that and everything, but no matter what's happening, it seems like Yo-Yo's powers aren't, kicking in to the point, like obviously Jiaying kind of notices that May's kind of got an empathic gift, so it's kind of like, all right, so I need you to kind of work with help Elena through her things, because it turns out it's not a physical thing like the Shrike, it's a psychological thing that's stopping her from using her abilities. And it's like, so she needs her powers, dive through her, like her emotional past. And then Yo-Yo's laughing because she's like, feelings aren't her thing. And then May's like, they're really not. And they're having to sit there and just like this, and I love May being like, this is like my worst nightmare ever. And Yo-Yo's like, I cannot agree, I am literally in the same boat. So it's just this awkward situation of like, they're sitting there and it's just like, they hate it, but it's like May approaches it her way, and her way ends up being a fight. It's just like, that's the more contact, like that, that's kind of how May would handle it. And I think Yo-Yo kind of appreciates that angle, because sitting around kind of just like meditating, and it's not their style anyway. So, but during the fight, we see like 3 different triggers for Elena. For one, it's when the Shrike got inside of her. Then the next one was when she killed Ruby. And then finally there was something when she was much younger, where her uncle ended up dying because of what she did. So basically, at the end of the day, what ended up happening was like, her father owed the wrong people. He got mixed up with the wrong people. She had to live with her uncle. And basically, to keep her aunt's necklace from being stolen from them, she ends up taking it, and the guy found out. And obviously, like, her uncle was trying to protect his son and Elena, and he ended up dying because of it. And so for her, that became like a psychological block, because now it's a thing of like, she was like, I shouldn't have moved. And now you're thinking like, okay, so that makes sense with a lot of stuff, because it's like, what happened with Ruby? Because she did it on instinct. Like, she's like, I need to kill Ruby. Ruby's the end of the world. And obviously Ruby ended up not being the end of the world. And like, you killed, like, no matter what, that still got to weigh on you that you ended up killing her. She was still a kid, I'm sure in Elena's mind too. So that made it worse. So it's a thing of like, that instinct of like jumping in and not thinking, like, without really thinking too much. And I think for her, like, that was a psychological thing as a kid that I think that trigger, like, it's always been, I think, a bit of her personality. She can, she kind of be impulsive. I think that's what that kind of represents. And that now all of that's kind of like, it's instances of her being kind of impulsive stacked upon itself. And it kind of created this like mental block on her ability, and I thought that was so interesting. But even with that discovery, it didn't stop her abilities from, it didn't allow her to still access her abilities. So at the same time, there's the whole thing on the Zephyr, because obviously it's like, they're trying to fix this situation, and I love deeply like, step back, electricity and stuff like that. And Daniel's like, I'm not a Neanderthal. And you have Enoch being like, oh yeah, he's like, I spent time with the Neanderthals, and Daniel doesn't look anything like them. He doesn't have the brow. And Daniel's just like, can we just push the button, please? So there's that whole thing. That didn't work. And it's like, all right, we got to get ready to parachute. Obviously, like, Mac had talked to, Coulson earlier about, bouncing this whole thing off, the whole not making make ripples, not waves type of situation with this whole afterlife situation. So, and then there's a whole conversation between Daisy and Coulson. It's actually really sad because it gets very existential, because for him it's like, for a year and a half he had this sensation of like, I want something to drink, I'm thirsty. But it's like, he's like, what part of my programming creates those ones and zeros? Even the whole thing of like, he's happy to kind of be in a body, but then it's like, you see like the look in him, because it's just that thing of like, at least before he felt a little human, but kind of being reduced to just that. And just this moment, it gets very existential for him, because I think it also brings up the question of like, well, what are you going to do at the end of the day? Because you are still going to be this LMD Chronocom hybrid, and that means you're going to outlive all these people you care about. You're not Coulson. Like, the whole conversations with May, I think, also play a role in that too, because that was like one of the last conversations he had, like, in his body, was the whole thing about May being like, you're not Coulson and everything like that. And also being able to come back. This is his technically third time coming back. Technically his fourth, actually. Like, if you don't count the whole situation last season like that, because that wasn't actually even him really. It was more just a copy of his body, but still, so technically this count. It's really his third time, but technically, if you want to get really technical about it, it could be technically considered his fourth time. So I think it's just that thing of waiting on you, just kind of coming back, and for him, it's a thing that, like, obviously it's like both of them are in bad condition, but they're both repairing. So it's like Daisy's getting healed up, he is too, but he's like, I'm happy, but you still see that sullen, like that melancholy look on his face, and you're just kind of like, oh, like I said, I think it's all like finally hitting him. Like, I think before he could just kind of like distance his mind from it, like, yeah, it might be something else, but at least he felt like himself. But now it's the thing of like how much of, like, a lot of this is just from the real Coulson, and just anything I'm feeling is just ones and zeros, like, like I say, very like existential. And I was like, oh, that's such an interesting angle. Like, it's only any episode a little bit. Well, I'm skipping around, but like at the end when it's like she's like, yeah, Gemma's trying to be like, oh, it's just gonna be like a nap. He's like, yeah, it's just like a nap, huh? So he's like, can I be the one to do it, to power himself down? And it's just like I said, you can tell Coulson's just not like himself because of all of this. So I think that's such an interesting angle that I'm curious to see, like, how they how that whole thing carries forward. There's a whole thing with Daniel, got him a new prosthetic and everything. It's like, yo, so he's gonna be rocking the same prosthetics, I'm sure, as as OG Coulson did, as well as, now Yo-Yo does as well. So I think that's going to be pretty interesting to see, like, what that ends up being like going forward. So I think that's such an interesting element. I also thought it was kind of neat, like, Daniel kind of apologizing to, he's like, the way I was acting, like, in the 70s and stuff like that. But for her, it's like, she's like, I get it. Like, you were pulled out of time and you just want to go home. He's like, I guess we're all in that same boat right now, So it is a thing of, and then her also, like, having that message for Fitz. She's like, I don't know if you'll even get this. She's basically saying nothing's going according to plan since she rescued the team from Izel's temple, like at the end of season 6. Like, nothing's been going according to plan. And she's like, we might even lose to Zephyr. So, but she's like, despite, everything, them being separate, time and space, we will kind of figure this out. We will find our way back to each other in some shape or form. So this might be leading us in the direction of finding out what Fitz might be up to this entire time. I'm curious to see how they handle that, because, like, I was wondering about, because I noticed that in the trailer. I was like, there wasn't a lot of Fitz. There might have been one or two scenes in the trailer that had Fitz. It's been a while, so I might be misremembering. But I noticed that at first. I was like, I didn't think I saw Fitz at all. But then I looked back. I was like, I think there's at least one thing in the trailer we might see Fitz. So it's like, we might go most of this season never seeing Fitz. He's going to pop up, obviously. But it's just like, I thought that was just kind of interesting, like an element to it. So, but and even Deke kind of being there, kind of hearing that message, between his grandmother and his grandfather, so there's that whole angle. Then going back to Afterlife, obviously there's the whole thing where Cora was trying to kill herself because her powers are so out of her control. She can't, she doesn't want to hurt anyone. But lo and behold, who shows up? Nathaniel. And it's like, okay, so Sybil wants you to save her specifically. Well, because I'm sure, like, later on, I would jump to it, but, like, obviously, like, he ends up, like, attacking all of Afterlife. So I'm assuming that's supposed to represent the fact is that was kind of their ultimate plan. Well, because his whole thing is about, like, oh, it's like, why should these people get gifts? It's like, oh, because basically you were just like a lucky draw. Like, it's just kind of like, because for him, it's the whole thing of, like, everything being set in stone. Like, the stars already said, like, his life was going to end. It said Cora's life was going to end. I'm guessing this is how her life ended. Because basically it was either going to be like this, or Lee was going to stab a knife in her chest. That was the way that, obviously they kill her in human ability and everything. Well, kill her and make sure her power, died and everything. But I thought that was such a, fascinating situation, because now, like, understanding, like obviously what he's getting out of it, like his connection to Hydra and everything, it makes sense. I mean, his drive is his own drive, but, him being an Amalek, it seems like that also plays some role in it. But obviously it's a thing of, like, you're fighting destiny because you're not supposed to be alive. She's not supposed to be alive. But I was wondering, like, is it specifically Cora that's the key? Like, can she be the beginning of some mass destruction? Or is it, like, a combination of her plus taking all of their abilities and giving them to other people? Because, like, Nathaniel's like, oh, let's call some anarchy. Because obviously for Cora, this Afterlife was her home. But then the problem was, when it was all said and done, though, it's like, because, Nathaniel kind of compared this to, like, a cult and everything. It's like, oh, they get you so wrapped up and make you believe what they want you to believe. And, now Cora kind of sees this place as a prison. Luckily, Gordon was able to get Jiaying and them out, but it's still a thing of like, they're probably going to meet up with her later on because it seems like they might still be kind of stuck within a certain time frame. We'll get to that soon enough. But she kind of has to disappear, and now it's like they're in afterlife kind of, all right, so what this means, how this all plays out in Sybil's, plans and stuff like that. But obviously they're getting back to the Zephyr, and, Elena's kind of beating herself up because she's like, I didn't figure everything out. I still don't have my powers. But, and then maybe like, yeah, they've had 2 days. They could have figured this out. Mate, they've only had 20 minutes. She's like, right, stupid time travel. It's that thing of like, right, it's been 2 days for us. It's actually only been 20 minutes for them. Damn these time jumps. But nevertheless, I even love that whole conversation with Enoch being like, oh yeah, but basically we're at that critical point. I forgot the exact wording he used. And he has Deke being like, well, that's comforting. Thanks, Enoch. But nevertheless, they get back. But as obviously for Elena, it's like, I still haven't figured it out. And it's like, well, we're just going to have to parachute. We're going to have to abandon the Zephyr. And it's just kind of like, she's like, this is... Before, she's like, knowing that it was like, an alien poison, fine. Like, that could be something. But now I realize it's on me. It's my own psychological block that's making this happen. And she's like... And then May's like, you will bounce back. And then she was like, I don't have to bounce back. And then she uses her powers and was like, holy shit. I was like, I don't quite get it. And then she does what she does to the machine. And then she stays in her spot. I was like, she didn't bounce back. I was like, what? I was like, that's dope. And even Mac was like, you didn't bounce back? She's like, I never had to. I was like, so basically Elena Yo-Yo has been on a limiter the entire time. Her whole thing obviously being like because I even love Daniel being like, wait, what's your power? It's like her thing is, once again, has always been about bouncing back. Why she's called Yo-Yo and everything. But it seems like that was actually, I actually think when you actually break that down, that's interesting. Basically, her psychological trauma as a kid, feeling like she was responsible for her uncle, it created that, and it manifested itself in her powers of like, basically, that was kind of like her safety net, being able to bounce back. It's because that moment of like, I wish I could have grabbed the necklace and bounced back. It's also that moment of just kind of like, I should have stood still. It's kind of what's ingrained in her head. So that's where the bounce back came from, because she is like, there's that part of her that's like, I should have stayed still. So it's like, if I'm able to do something quickly, boom, boom, and then come back, then she thought like it'd be okay, because there's instances where I should have just stayed still, and once again, her kind of reacting without really thinking, kind of, I think the psychological, it's so interesting to think like her psychological thing. I mean, it makes sense, but it's like, it created this limiter on your ability. I mean, granted, she still has a heartbeat thing, but still, like, this means she could go bam, bam, bam. She could use, because before she used her power, like, she'd always have to go back to where she was. Now she doesn't. She could always start where she is. So wherever she could get within a heartbeat, boom, then she could keep going and going. Like, this unlocks new possibilities with her ability. I was like, that's such an interesting thing. Because especially because I felt like this is so interesting, because I feel like, I mean, it's been a while since I've seen the earlier seasons. I don't remember them really going into Yo-Yo's past like they did in this episode. So I thought that was kind of interesting, making it... Well, because there's also like those mini little slingshots things. I still never watched them. I always meant to, but I kept putting them off until I almost forgot they existed. There's a couple seasons back, there was a whole like Yo-Yo thing. They were like little 10-minute episode things, I think, where they were like little mini things about Yo-Yo. They were called Slingshot, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. But maybe there was stuff about her past in that I just didn't, because I had never watched them. Once again, I meant to, but I kept putting it off and I forgot about it. I need to see if I can like track those down somewhere. But nevertheless, I just thought that was like such a dope thing, and it's just like, holy crap. And she saved the day, but obviously there's all the stuff with Nathaniel, so it's like, I even love the thing of Deke being like, oh, so are we gonna be able to fix it? It's like, maybe. He's also like, and Deke being like, oh, I'm gonna miss some stuff about the 80s. Hey, Enoch, do you know how to drum? He's like, I can keep tempo. I was like, hey, you found your new drummer after your last drummer got brutally murdered by a robot last episode. Ugh. Let's kind of move past that. But then the drive activates, and it's like, wait, we didn't fix it. Things are still wrong. Or maybe that's something on Fitz's angle, which part, because like it was shut down, but not unless they put it back online to try and fix it. Whatever case, maybe part of me thinks maybe that's Fitz kind of doing something as well. Who knows? It's definitely going to be interesting to see where all of this ends up taking us going forward into the next episode. But really, that's all I'm going to talk about. Until the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day, and goodbye.